Today on the Nivlac 57 YouTube channel, we're going to talk about bump steer, some cage upgrades we did to my Studebaker, and an update on my dad's health. So let's get right into it. You probably noticed in some of the background shots of some of the previous videos that we have already started working on the front suspension on my Studebaker. And as you can see, we had to do some pretty major rework from what it was before. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with Studebakers, pretty much from the early 50s into the end of their production, they had a dual A-arm knee joint style suspension. Now, this suspension design was really state of the art in probably the late 30s to early 40s, but you know, they pretty much took the philosophy of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This suspension design is sort of a weird one. It's a double A-arm setup, but it also has kingpins. So it's definitely on the weird side, and you know, just for serviceability and the better handling aspects, we got rid of all that junk and we converted it to this, which is a Mustang 2 front suspension. Now, the Mustang 2 front suspension is also a double A-arm, but it features a ball joint on the upper and lower, and it has a control arm with a radius rod. And one change you will notice right off of the bat is that we relocated the radius arm on the lower control arm. We did this in order to give more room for you know, headers and basically make the engine easier to fit into the car. And as a consequence of that, you know, the radius arm and the steering tie rod are trying to occupy the same space. When we had the steering rack in the original location, we actually had to make these modified radius arms like what you see here with this little offset right here. And basically what this offset did was it made clearance for that tie rod end. Now, since I wanted to put 180-degree headers onto this car and make it sound cool, we needed to make a little bit of room for those headers, and therefore we had to move the steering rack. And because of this, we had to totally re-engineer our radius arms, and we basically ended up with what you see here. To do this, I bought some brand new radius arms from Speedway, and basically we had to set it up with this offset that you see here on the radius arm. In order to make this offset, I needed to find something that was made of good quality metal and sort of had that shape already. So I went into my mental catalog and I thought, oh, what about those pin poppers that they use to pop the pins out of your doors on like a Chevy Nova or something. And so I did a quick Google search and found that you could buy those pin poppers for a fairly affordable price, and decided to use that because it's made of good quality metal and it matched the shape that I needed. So I cut the radius arms off and then welded those pin poppers on, and you know, sort of had to play around with them a little bit to get the exact shape that I wanted. But we ended up with what you see here. Now, you'll notice that the offset is a pretty significant offset. Unfortunately, I can't really set up the bump steer on this, which we will get into in a moment. I can't really set the bump steer up and build the radius arm at the same time because I need to have the radius arm in order to set up the bump steer. But in order to build the radius arm, I need to know where the steering arm is going to be. So I had to basically just manufacture it with a lot of clearance, and that's why it has the pretty heavy offset. Probably could have gotten away with a little bit less, but it'll work. So what is bump steer? Bump steer is basically when your toe changes, meaning your angle this way changes over the travel of the suspension. And to illustrate that, I've actually put some bump steer into my suspension setup, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. So if I move my wheel over the travel of the suspension, you'll notice that it goes from an angle sort of like this to an angle sort of like this, and I think you can see it pretty clearly there, but basically we are seeing a toe change over the suspension travel. Now on a AA arm suspension like this, you can totally eliminate your bump steer in most cases. And I've actually gone through the trouble of doing that to this thing already. And how you do that is you basically, you change the height of your steering rack. In some cases, you may actually have to change the steering rack to another steering rack, or you change the height of your tie rod end. So in order to totally eliminate the bump steer on a AA arm setup, a good rule of thumb is to put a rack that has a pivot point, you know, basically the point where your tie rod moves up and down on, that is about in line with your A-arm suspension points. So your lower control arm pivots on basically this point, and your upper control arm pivots on, it's about here. So you want a tie rod end that, you know, based on where you place it, to be about in line with these 2 points. So if I were to draw a line from here to here, we want that tie rod pivot point to be about on that same line. So when you are buying a steering rack, you want to keep that in mind, and in this case I've done that pretty well. Since my steering rack height is pretty well dictated by the header clearance that I needed, the only real way to dial in the bump steer with something where you can't adjust the height of the rack is to adjust the height of the tie rod, which you can do with something like this. So if I zoom in here, this is basically they call it a bump steer kit. Basically it is a threaded rod with a tapered seat that goes into the Ford Mustang spindle. And what I can do with this is it actually comes with a couple of nuts, and you can play around with the height until you eliminate the bump steer. So basically how we do this is we put our first nut onto the bump steer, and then we put our tie rod onto the tie rod end. Kind of like that, and then you're going to lock that down, and then basically what you're going to do is you're going to jack up the suspension and let it down a bunch of times. And basically how I normally do it is I put plumb bobs on either end, and you can see I have these 2 pieces of tape on the floor, and I basically go through the travel and mark the difference between the front and back. So it took me a little while, but after I got done with that, I machined some fixed spacers of the right height, and now I will assemble this whole deal with the final product. So now that I have my fixed spacer, I can slip that up on, then I can slip my tie rod on. And then put my misalignment spacer on, and put both of the nuts on, and just like that, we're good to go. One other thing I have to show off here is with the Mustang front suspension, rather than going to a tubular lower control arm, I decided to work with the radius arm. Just because everything was already engineered to take all of the forces there, and I didn't want to put all of the forces into the cross member, especially because I had eliminated the cross member. So we got rid of the rubber bushings, as you can see here, and we went to the spherical bushings. I custom machined basically this entire setup here. I made these little spherical bushing receivers, drilled some holes in there. There's one on either side. And then I made these custom spacers that receive into the spherical bushing. And the idea here is I'm already re-engineering the radius arm, so why not go to a superior setup where it will have less resistance. If you think about it, this rubber bushing setup is kind of acting like a shock absorber and not letting the front suspension travel as easily. So we can remove that and make it so that the front end will travel a little better. I'm actually going to move this up and down just so you guys can see what this looks like. And yeah, so we decided to go with that upgrade right there. Now normally, I'm not a center cap guy.
This is why we can't have nice things.
But this is the one style of wheel that I actually like the center caps on. So I'm going to throw these guys on and have a look. That looks great. Nice. All right, next let's talk about what you've probably already noticed a couple times, and that is the new wheels that I picked up for my Studebaker Lark. Now, ever since I was a very young kid, I have always wanted myself a set of torque thrust Ds. And since the wheels that I originally had on this car were transferred over to the Volvo, and there's only like one good one remaining, I think it was time to finally go with my sort of dream wheel setup. And I decided to buy a set of torque thrust Ds for the car. Now, originally I was going to just leave the gray center like what they come from the factory with, but my dad convinced me to throw a little bit of color at the car, so I decided to go with this gold center, and I really hope that the gold center works well with the blue exterior to the car and really makes the car pop. Frankly, I can't wait to get a set of tires on these wheels and get the rest of them painted and get this thing onto the ground. It is going to be a really neat looking setup, and I can't wait to look at it. My Studebaker is I wanted to complete the roll cage. Originally, it just had this roll bar in the car, just a 6-point deal. And since the Volvo, you know, I definitely want to start making every car that we do a little overbuilt safety-wise. So Dad and I ended up bending up this roll cage section to basically make this into a 850 cert roll cage. Now, part of this roll cage is I wanted to tie it into the actual car, and that's because the front end stiffness is a little bit lacking, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, with an 850 cert roll cage, they require an 1 5/8" tube. And if you run chromoly, you can run a little bit thinner tube. This is 083 wall thickness, but the catch with chromoly is every joint has to be TIG welded. Luckily, I know a guy that can TIG weld. It's me. One other thing that I wanted to show you guys is if you are welding in an 850 cert cage section in a car that already has a roll bar, is this joint right here in the back at the top. That is the hardest joint to get. And the reason for that is you can't lower the main hoop down and give yourself some room to weld. Therefore, we put this little bend in the cage and tried to make it so that I could access it from the rear window here. Since they still go up and down, I was able to get a pretty good view of what I was doing. But for the last little bit, we had to use a mirror. And basically, I stuck that guy up in there. And I can actually show you a little bit better of how I had to do that, because I haven't actually welded this side. So I'll show you how that works. Alright, for the last little section of the weld, we're going to have to employ a little hand mirror like what you see here. You can see that up in here, this is definitely tight quarters, and it's really hard for me to get my head up in there where I can see it. So what we do is we get ourselves a mirror, tape it to the roof of the car, and then that allows us to get up in there with the torch and weld it. And just like that, we got ourselves a nice weld there, and it is 100% around. The reason that we do this is because the NHRA requires that you do a full perimeter weld on any joint in the cage, and if you don't, they require that you add a gusset to the cage, and that will replace up to 25% of the weld. Alright, so we thought that the worst of the aftermath from the wreck with the Volvo was over, but it turns out that we still had a few more hurdles to get over with Dad, so I'm going to hand it over to him and let him tell you what he's been going through the past couple of weeks.
Hey guys, Calvin's pop here, Andrew. Hey, appreciate all the well wishes that we've been getting and everybody reaching out to us. Truly heartfelt. Appreciate the visits. Obviously the recovery has been taking a lot longer than expected. You know, 2.5 months ago, after we had the crash in Georgia, we thought that it was less intense than what it has turned out to be, and obviously from the sling you can tell that I'm still having to deal with some significant injuries that have to heal. The ribs have healed up pretty good. I feel good there. The vertebrae has healed up. I feel very good there. The pain in my hip is still very real. I'm probably 80% healed in that. I have my good days and bad days. My eyes have healed up well. I'm still struggling with the concussion, and the latest round of repair work here has been to my shoulder. The 3 of the 4 muscles in my shoulder were torn away from the bone. Ultimately, the doctor had to go in, drill new anchor points, and fasten those muscles back to my skeletal system. And that has been pretty intense on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most severe. The doctor said that my shoulder injury was a 9. and trying to keep me under control has been a big challenge for Calvin. I've been able to participate in a few things, but obviously one of the most important things that I can do to accelerate the healing process and the recovery process is to keep this stable and immobile. And anybody who knows me knows that that's probably a full-time job for Calvin, having to sit on me so that I don't move. But I really want to extend my heartfelt appreciation for all of you who've reached out. I love reading the comments. Well, that's the wrong word. I don't love reading the comments because that means I'm hurt, but I appreciate the genuine sentiment that has been expressed in word and in phone calls and in visits. I can't understate that. I'm a social bee. Anybody who knows me knows that I love people. I love talking with people. I love visiting with people. And to no longer have my driving privileges until I heal and get past this, it puts me in a position where I'm home all the time, except for doctor's appointments at this point. So keep on reaching out. Let Calvin know how much you appreciate him having to babysit his pop while I deal with the recovery process. But you know, I'm super excited with some of the things that are going on and things that you can anticipate. We're talking about future plans. Unfortunately, we're having to sideline a major project that we had planned, the Two Dudes for Two Studes. Yeah. Sorry, I can't even say it straight. The Two Dudes with Two Studes project. It's going to have to be put on hold. What we're anticipating is that my recovery, because of my age, is going to take a little longer than expected, and putting myself into a manual shifted car and being in competition as early as I want it to be is not something I think is prudent at this point. So in reflecting what we enjoy, what we want to do, where we want to go, it's given us an opportunity to bat around different ideas. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get much video content out because of that, but ultimately it has led us to the opportunity to hone in on some ideas of things that excite us, that we hope will excite you guys. It's more old school type builds with new school flair, and I'm super excited about that, because things that Calvin has been wanting to do, I actually have been wanting to do, and we share an affinity towards a certain car that may seem odd, but in going back in history, I can share a lot of details that will be talked about in upcoming videos. In addition to that, we can go do some leaf spring work. Just have fun. Slapper bars.
I think we're gonna maybe go into that the next video. So just in case you guys missed it, the 48 Studebaker that we were building for my dad in the Two Dudes, Two Studes series, unfortunately that is going to have to be put on hold for a little while. As my dad said earlier, he is in no shape to be stick shifting right now, and yeah, can't really take his hand off the wheel to do it with his left hand. So you know, obviously he's going to be able to do that someday, but we don't need to be pushing that for drag week. So in the next video, we are actually going to be starting a new project, and I hope you guys will be excited with the direction that we are going with that. And that will be his car for drag week. Unfortunately, we can't bring the Two Studes.
What do you mean I can't tell him about our new project? I can't wait to share this.
Well, we gotta have him come back for the next video. We gotta give him something.
Now, I want to share.
Well, next video we're gonna unveil our new project. Sorry guys, I'm not gonna let him spill the beans quite yet. So make sure that you stay tuned. We'll be back. So make sure that you stay tuned for the next video. Make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. Consider buying a t-shirt. Links are in the description. We'll see you in the next one.